You thought you were so clever, little bird. Victoria Kozlov's voice echoed through the empty warehouse as she circled the chair where Sarah Blake sat bound. 3 years. 3 years you served drinks in my establishment, cleaned glasses, listened to conversations. Did you really think I wouldn't discover who you are? The woman they called the Empress held up a photograph. FBI Academy graduation, class of 2019, Agent Sarah Blake front and center. Phoenix, Victoria continued, reading from a classified file. Code name Phoenix. How poetic. Because tonight, you're going to burn. Sarah said nothing, her green eyes calculating even as Victoria's men positioned weapons around the room. What Victoria didn't know was that every word being spoken was being transmitted to FBI headquarters through a device so small, so perfectly hidden, that even the most thorough search would never find it. The mind games were just beginning. Welcome to True Stories Zone. Before we dive into this incredible story of psychological warfare, brilliant strategy, and a moment when a young FBI agent faced the most dangerous criminal mind of her generation, tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, hit that subscribe button. 3 years earlier, Sarah Blake had walked into the FBI Academy at Quantico, carrying a psychology degree from MIT and an IQ that had been measured at 167. At 23, she was the youngest agent in her class, but her combination of analytical brilliance and photographic memory had caught the attention of the Bureau's most classified division, Deep Cover Operations. The mission they offered her was unprecedented in its scope and danger. The Kozlov organization, led by the enigmatic Victoria, the Empress Kozlov, had built a criminal empire that spanned from Brighton Beach to Moscow, dealing in everything from arms trafficking to high-level political assassination. Traditional law enforcement had failed to penetrate their operations because Victoria was more than just a crime boss. She was a former Russian intelligence officer with a mind for strategy that had made her untouchable. Agent Blake, Director Morrison had explained during her final briefing, Victoria Kozlov is not your typical organized crime leader. She's a chess grandmaster who views criminal operations as elaborate games to be won through superior intellect. She's eliminated 12 FBI informants over the past 5 years, each one discovered through psychological manipulation and strategic thinking that we're only beginning to understand. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Sarah would assume the identity of Sarah Mitchell, a young woman with a fabricated background that would make her invisible to standard background checks, but appealing to the Kozlov organization's recruitment efforts. She would work her way into Victoria's inner circle, gather intelligence, and build a case that could finally bring down an organization that had operated with impunity for over a decade. What no one anticipated was that the mission would require Sarah to become someone else so completely that even she sometimes forgot where Sarah Blake ended and Sarah Mitchell began. Sarah's cover identity was meticulously crafted. Sarah Mitchell was an orphan from Detroit who had aged out of foster care, worked a series of dead-end jobs, and possessed just enough desperation to make her recruitment by criminal organizations seem natural. Her background included minor arrests for shoplifting and drug possession, all carefully staged by the FBI to create a convincing criminal history. The Empress's organization recruited from a specific pool, young women who were intelligent enough to be useful but desperate enough to be loyal. Sarah fit the profile perfectly, and within 6 months of arriving in Brighton Beach, she had been hired as a bartender at the Golden Swan, an upscale restaurant that served as the unofficial headquarters of Victoria's empire. For 3 years, Sarah served drinks to arms dealers, money launderers, and assassins. She cleaned glasses while listening to conversations about weapons shipments to conflict zones. She smiled at men who bragged about eliminating witnesses and women who discussed the finer points of political blackmail. But most importantly, she studied Victoria Kozlov. The Empress was not what Sarah had expected. Instead of the brutal crime boss depicted in FBI files, Victoria was elegant, sophisticated, and possessed of a strategic mind that impressed even Sarah's analytical intelligence. She spoke 7 languages fluently, held advanced degrees in psychology and economics, and ran her criminal empire with the precision of a Fortune 500 corporation. Victoria's methods were psychological rather than physical. She rarely resorted to violence, preferring to manipulate her enemies into destroying themselves. She studied people like specimens under a microscope, identifying their weaknesses and exploiting them with surgical precision. Control, Victoria had once explained to her lieutenants during a meeting Sarah overheard, is not about fear. Fear is temporary and requires constant reinforcement. True control comes from understanding what people want most and making them believe you're the only one who can provide it. It was during these 3 years that Sarah began to understand the full scope of Victoria's operations. The arms trafficking and money laundering were just the visible portions of an organization that had influence reaching into the highest levels of government and business. Victoria had dirt on senators, judges, and corporate executives. She had assets in foreign intelligence services and contacts in terrorist organizations. But she also had weaknesses, and Sarah was methodically cataloging every one of them. Sarah's downfall came not from a mistake in her cover story or a slip in her fabricated identity, but from something she couldn't have anticipated: Victoria's photographic memory and obsessive attention to detail. It began with a seemingly innocent observation. During a busy evening at the Golden Swan, Sarah had automatically calculated the optimal arrangement for serving a large party, moving through the dining room with an efficiency that minimized steps while maximizing coverage. It was the kind of spatial analysis that came naturally to someone with her IQ, but to Victoria's trained eye, it revealed something more. Interesting, Victoria had murmured to her lieutenant, Dmitri, as they watched Sarah work. 3 years as a bartender, but she moves through the room like someone trained in tactical efficiency. The second clue came during a conversation about international finance. One of Victoria's money launderers had made an error in his calculations, and Sarah had automatically corrected him before catching herself. The correction was subtle, but it demonstrated knowledge of complex financial instruments that a foster care dropout from Detroit should never have possessed. Victoria began testing her. She would leave classified documents where Sarah might see them while cleaning, then watch to see if Sarah's behavior changed. She arranged conversations about FBI operations in Sarah's hearing, monitoring her reactions for any sign of recognition or concern. The final piece of evidence came from an unexpected source. Victoria had contacts in various government agencies, and a routine background check request eventually flagged the identity of Sarah Mitchell as a potential FBI cover. The request itself was subtle, just a query about whether the identity might be fabricated, but it was enough. Victoria spent 2 weeks verifying the information before making her move. She used facial recognition software to compare surveillance footage of Sarah with FBI Academy graduation photos. She had her contacts run deep background checks that revealed the carefully constructed but ultimately false nature of Sarah's identity. When Victoria finally confirmed that her bartender was actually Special Agent Sarah Blake of the FBI, her reaction was not anger, but admiration. "Brilliant," she had told Dmitri. "Absolutely brilliant. They sent me someone who could actually challenge me intellectually. How refreshing." The warehouse where Victoria chose to confront Sarah had been selected with the same strategic thinking that characterized all of her operations. It was isolated, soundproof, and equipped with sophisticated counter-surveillance equipment that would block any transmission devices, or so Victoria believed. What she didn't know was that Sarah's communication device wasn't electronic. During her time undercover, Sarah had developed a system of chemical markers that could be activated by specific combinations of stress hormones and adrenaline. The device, implanted beneath her skin during a staged medical procedure, would release microscopic tracers that could be detected by specially equipped FBI surveillance teams from a distance of up to 5 miles. "I have to admit," Victoria said as she walked around Sarah's chair, "I'm impressed by the operation. 3 years of deep cover, flawless identity fabrication, and insertion into my organization at exactly the right level to be useful, but not suspicious. Someone put considerable thought into this." Sarah remained silent, her mind working through multiple scenarios and contingency plans. She had prepared for this moment, knowing that discovery was always a possibility in deep cover operations. But what I find most fascinating, Victoria continued, is that you almost succeeded. If it weren't for your unconscious behavioral patterns, the way you move, the way you think, the way you automatically solve problems, you might have maintained your cover indefinitely. Victoria moved to stand directly in front of Sarah, studying her face with the intensity of a scientist examining a particularly interesting specimen. The question now is, what do we do with you? Sarah finally spoke, her voice calm despite the circumstances. That depends on what you want, Victoria. What I want, Victoria replied, is to understand how the FBI trained someone to think like I do. Because that's what you've been doing, isn't it? You've been studying me, learning my methods, anticipating my moves. In a way, they've created a mirror image of me. Is that what you think? Sarah asked. Victoria smiled. I know it. And I also know that you've been gathering intelligence on my operations for 3 years. You probably have enough evidence to bring down half my organization. Probably. Which brings us to our current situation, Victoria said, gesturing to the armed men positioned around the warehouse. You have information I can't allow you to use, and I have something you want to protect. Victoria nodded to Dimitri, who produced a tablet displaying surveillance footage of a suburban house. On the screen, Sarah could see her parents and younger brother going about their daily routines, unaware that they were being watched. Your family, Agent Blake. Your real family, not the fabricated orphan story. Dr. Robert Blake, mathematics professor at Northwestern University. Dr. Linda Blake, pediatric surgeon at Chicago General Hospital. And young Marcus Blake, senior at Northwestern Prep Academy. Such accomplished people. Sarah's expression didn't change, but Victoria was watching for micro-expressions, tiny tells that would reveal emotional response. Here's what's going to happen, Victoria continued. You're going to provide me with a complete list of every FBI operation targeting my organization. You're going to identify every informant, every surveillance operation, every planned raid. And in exchange, your family continues their comfortable, safe lives. And if I refuse? Victoria's smile was cold. Then your family discovers what it's like to disappoint the Kozlov organization. I believe your brother has early admission to MIT next year. Such a bright future ahead of him. It was a classic Victoria Kozlov manipulation. Identify what the target values most, then threaten it in a way that forces compliance. But Victoria had made one crucial error in her psychological assessment. She had underestimated Sarah's capacity for strategic thinking. I need time to consider your offer, Sarah said after a long moment. Victoria raised an eyebrow. Time? Agent Blake, I don't think you understand the situation. Your family's safety depends on your immediate cooperation. I understand the situation perfectly, Sarah replied. But what you're asking for, a complete list of FBI operations, that's not information I can access from memory. It would require me to contact my handlers, access secure databases, coordinate with multiple field offices. If you want comprehensive intelligence, you need to give me the resources to obtain it. Victoria studied her carefully. This wasn't the desperate compliance she had expected from someone whose family was under threat. What exactly are you proposing? Give me 48 hours, Sarah said. Allow me to contact my FBI handlers and tell them I need to extract immediately due to a compromised situation. I'll tell them I need to download everything I've learned before the operation is blown completely. Once I have access to the full intelligence package, I'll turn it over to you. And why would I trust you to return? Sarah met her gaze steadily. Because you have my family, and because you know that I know you're smart enough to kill them if I don't return. Victoria was intrigued despite herself. You're proposing to walk back into FBI headquarters, convince them to give you access to classified intelligence about their own operations, and then return here to hand it over to me. Yes, that's either the most honest response I've ever heard from a federal agent, or you're playing a game even more complex than I initially thought. Sarah shrugged. Does it matter? Either way, you get what you want. Victoria considered the proposal for several minutes, running through possible scenarios and contingencies. The request was logical. Accessing comprehensive intelligence would indeed require the resources Sarah described, but also gave Sarah an opportunity to escape or call for backup. Very well, Victoria decided. 48 hours. But understand this. I have people watching your family every moment. I have contacts in the FBI who will report if you attempt to organize any kind of rescue operation. And I have methods of retaliation that will reach your family no matter where they try to hide. Understand. I hope you do, Victoria said, signaling for her men to untie Sarah. Because the game we're playing now has only two possible outcomes. Either you return with the intelligence I've requested, or your family pays the price for your failure. What Victoria didn't realize was that Sarah had just set in motion a plan that had been 3 years in the making. Sarah's return to FBI headquarters created exactly the kind of controlled chaos she had anticipated. Her extraction from deep cover was treated as an emergency operation, with multiple divisions mobilized to debrief her and assess the damage to ongoing operations. Agent Blake, Director Morrison said during her first briefing, "We need to understand exactly what the Kozlov organization knows about our operations and how they discovered your identity." Sarah provided a carefully edited version of events that emphasized Victoria's psychological sophistication while downplaying the specific methods used to discover her cover. She requested access to comprehensive files on the Kozlov organization, claiming she needed to understand the full scope of Victoria's operations to anticipate her next moves. What Sarah didn't tell the FBI was that she had been preparing for this moment since the beginning of her deep cover assignment. Every conversation she had overheard, every document she had glimpsed, every detail of Victoria's operations had been carefully cataloged in her memory using advanced mnemonic techniques. But more importantly, Sarah had been building a psychological profile of Victoria Kozlov that went far beyond what any FBI analyst had achieved. She understood Victoria's strategic thinking, her decision-making patterns, her emotional triggers, and most crucially, her weaknesses. Victoria's greatest strength, her belief in her own intellectual superiority, was also her greatest vulnerability. She was so confident in her ability to manipulate others that she sometimes failed to consider that she might be the one being manipulated. Sarah spent her 48 hours at FBI headquarters not gathering intelligence to give to Victoria, but finalizing a plan that would destroy the Kozlov organization from within while protecting her family and maintaining her cover. The key was understanding that Victoria viewed their conflict as a chess game, with moves and countermoves based on rational strategic thinking. But Sarah was about to change the rules of the game entirely. When Sarah returned to the warehouse exactly 48 hours later, she carried with her a briefcase containing what appeared to be comprehensive FBI intelligence on the Kozlov organization. Victoria was waiting with the same configuration of armed guards, but Sarah noticed subtle changes in positioning that suggested increased paranoia. "Agent Blake," Victoria greeted her. "I confess I wasn't entirely certain you would return." "I gave you my word," Sarah replied, setting the briefcase on the table between them. Victoria gestured for the briefcase, but Sarah didn't move to open it. "Before we proceed," Sarah said, "I want to see proof that my family is safe." Victoria nodded to Dmitri, who produced the tablet showing live surveillance footage of the Blake family home. Sarah could see her parents and brother moving around the house, apparently unaware of the cameras. "Satisfied?" Victoria asked. "For now," Sarah replied, opening the briefcase to reveal several thick folders and multiple USB drives. "This contains everything the FBI has on your organization. Financial records, surveillance reports, informant identities, planned operations. 3 years of intelligence gathering." Victoria began examining the documents, her expression growing more interested with each page. The intelligence was genuine. Sarah had indeed provided real FBI files on the Kozlov organization. "This is very comprehensive," Victoria said after several minutes. "But I noticed some gaps. For instance, there's no mention of Operation Blackbird." "Operation Blackbird?" Sarah asked, allowing a hint of confusion to enter her voice. "A joint operation between the FBI and Russian intelligence to monitor my communications with contacts in Moscow. Surely you would have been briefed on such an operation." Sarah shook her head. "I've never heard of Operation Blackbird." Victoria smiled. "Of course you haven't, because it doesn't exist. I was testing you to see if you would fabricate information to fill gaps in your intelligence. Did I pass your test? You did. Which brings us to the next phase of our arrangement. Victoria closed the briefcase and looked directly at Sarah. This intelligence is valuable, but it's also historical. What I really need is ongoing access to FBI operations. I want you to return to your handlers and resume your role as a double agent. Sarah had anticipated this request. You want me to spy on the FBI for you. I want you to provide me with advance warning of any operations targeting my organization. In exchange, your family remains safe, and you receive compensation that will make your government salary seem insignificant. And if I refuse, then your family discovers that disappointing the Kozlov organization has consequences. Sarah appeared to consider the proposal for several minutes before nodding slowly. I'll need guarantees about my family's safety. You have my word. Your word isn't enough, Sarah said firmly. I want her people pulled back from surveillance of my family. I want written assurance that they won't be harmed as long as I provide intelligence. And I want a communication protocol that doesn't require face-to-face meetings. Victoria was impressed despite herself. Even under extreme duress, Sarah was negotiating like a professional. Very well. We can arrange secure communications, but understand that any attempt to deceive me or provide false intelligence will result in immediate retaliation against your family. I understand, Sarah said, but I have one more condition, which is, I want to know how you really discover my identity, not the surface explanation about behavioral patterns and background checks. I want to understand the specific method you used. Victoria smiled. You want to know so you can avoid making the same mistakes in the future. I want to know because understanding your methods will help me provide better intelligence. It was a reasonable request, and Victoria's ego made her susceptible to the opportunity to demonstrate her intellectual superiority. Very well, Victoria said. It was actually quite simple once I knew what to look for. You see, Agent Blake, you've been under surveillance by my organization for the entire 3 years of your assignment. Sarah maintained her composure, but internally she was calculating the implications of this revelation. Not traditional surveillance, Victoria continued. Something much more sophisticated. Every electronic device you've used, every credit card transaction, every digital footprint you've created has been monitored by my contacts in various government and private sector positions. Victoria gestured to a wall display that Sarah hadn't noticed before. It showed a comprehensive timeline of her activities over the past 3 years. Locations visited, purchases made, communications sent, and patterns of behavior. The FBI created an excellent cover identity for Sarah Mitchell, Victoria explained. But they couldn't erase the digital trail of Agent Sarah Blake entirely. Small inconsistencies began to emerge over time. Credit reports that didn't quite match your supposed work history. Social media connections that suggested a background different from your cover story. Medical records that indicated treatments inconsistent with your fabricated past. Sarah realized that Victoria had just revealed the most crucial weakness in her organization's security: overconfidence in their surveillance capabilities. Impressive, Sarah said, but if you've been watching me for 3 years, why wait until now to confront me? Because, Victoria replied, you were providing me with valuable intelligence about FBI operations simply by being placed in my organization. Every move the FBI made, every strategy they employed, every resource they allocated to investigating me was revealed through your presence. You've been using me to spy on the FBI. I've been using the FBI's own asset to understand their capabilities and limitations. And now, with your cooperation, I can expand that intelligence gathering operation significantly. Victoria had just made the mistake Sarah had been waiting for. By revealing the extent of her surveillance capabilities and her strategy for using Sarah as an unwitting double agent, Victoria had provided the final pieces of information Sarah needed to complete her plan. There's just one problem with your strategy, Sarah said quietly, which is, you assumed I didn't know I was being watched. The expression on Victoria's face shifted from confident superiority to sharp attention as she processed Sarah's words. What do you mean? Sarah smiled for the first time since entering the warehouse. I mean that everything you've been watching for the past 3 years has been carefully orchestrated. Every digital footprint, every behavioral pattern, every piece of intelligence you think you've gathered has been part of a comprehensive deception operation. Victoria's hand moved toward the panic button that would summon additional security, but Sarah continued speaking with calm authority. The inconsistencies in my credit reports, planted by the FBI to create a trail you could follow. The social media connections that didn't match my cover story, fabricated to make you think you were discovering hidden information. The medical records that suggested a different background, created specifically to feed your surveillance operation false data. That's impossible, Victoria said, but her voice carried a note of uncertainty. The FBI has known about your surveillance capabilities for over a year, Sarah continued. We've been feeding your network false information while building a comprehensive case against your organization. Every person you think you have compromised in government agencies, every contact you believe you have in law enforcement, every source you trust for intelligence has been identified and turned. Victoria reached for her communication device, but Sarah shook her head. I wouldn't do that if I were you. The people you're planning to contact are no longer taking orders from the Kozlov organization. As if summoned by her words, the warehouse doors opened and FBI tactical teams poured in from multiple entrances. Victoria's guards, rather than resisting, immediately dropped their weapons and raised their hands. You see, Sarah explained as Victoria stared in shock at the betrayal of her own security team. The real deception wasn't my cover identity. It was making you believe you had discovered and turned me, when actually we had discovered and turned your entire surveillance network. Director Morrison entered the warehouse, flanked by additional agents. Victoria Kozlov, you're under arrest for conspiracy, racketeering, arms trafficking, and approximately 47 other federal charges. As the handcuffs were placed on Victoria's wrists, she looked at Sarah with something approaching respect. How long? She asked quietly. How long what? How long have you known about my surveillance? Sarah considered the question. From the beginning. The FBI placed me in your organization not to gather intelligence on your operations, but to feed false information to your intelligence network while we systematically dismantled your organization from within. The intelligence you just gave me is completely fabricated. Every document, every file, every piece of information was created specifically to test your analytic capabilities and identify the full extent of your network. Victoria was silent for several moments as the full scope of her defeat became clear. Brilliant, she said finally. Absolutely brilliant. You spent 3 years pretending to be a bartender while actually conducting one of the most sophisticated counterintelligence operations in FBI history. Actually, Sarah corrected as Victoria was led away, I really was just a bartender. Everything else was just a game. The arrests that followed Victoria Kozlov's capture dismantled one of the most sophisticated criminal organizations in modern history. Over 200 individuals were indicted across 12 countries, including government officials, business leaders, and criminal operatives who had believed themselves untouchable. The key to the operation's success had been the FBI's recognition that Victoria's greatest strength, her ability to manipulate people through psychological analysis, could be turned against her through a more sophisticated manipulation strategy. Sarah's 3 years undercover had not been spent simply gathering intelligence, but orchestrating a complex deception that fed Victoria's ego while systematically identifying and turning her entire network of contacts and informants. The psychological warfare between Sarah and Victoria had indeed been a chess match, but Sarah had been playing by different rules from the beginning. While Victoria believed she was engaged in a battle of intellects with an FBI agent, Sarah had actually been conducting a comprehensive counterintelligence operation that used Victoria's own methods against her. 6 months after Victoria's arrest, Sarah received a letter in prison mail. It contained just 4 words, "Well played, Agent Blake." It was signed with the initials VK. Sarah kept the letter as a reminder that the most dangerous opponents are often the ones who can appreciate superior strategy, even in defeat. Her family, who had never actually been in danger thanks to FBI protection they were unaware of, learned about her real profession when the operation was declassified. Her parents were proud, Her brother was impressed, and all of them were relieved to discover that the quiet, unassuming daughter and sister they thought they knew had actually been one of the FBI's most effective undercover operatives. Sarah returned to normal FBI operations, but her success with the Kozlov case established her reputation as one of the Bureau's premier specialists in psychological operations and criminal manipulation. Because sometimes the best way to catch a genius is to let them think they're catching you.